Good evening, everyone. Tonight we have a large crowd of people, participants from across the United States, and I just learned from Australia and India, Canada, and Europe. So wherever you are, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I'm not exactly sure what time it is where you are, but my name is Sister Maria Pascuzzi. I am the director of Spirit Alive, and on behalf of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York, I welcome all of you tonight to the second webinar presentation for our Sexuality and the Sacred series. Before I introduce our distinguished presenter, please bear with me for a few announcements. Many of you write week after week, and so I felt compelled to announce week after week. Each seminar is recorded, and it is posted to the Spirit Alive YouTube channel. It usually takes our tech, Matthew, about 48 to 72 hours to edit and post that recording on the YouTube site. So please be patient. You can access the recording by going to the Spirit Alive homepage, where you can click on recordings, and that will take you to the library of recordings that are on the Spirit Alive YouTube page. We don't take them down. It's a library. You can always go back to them, and you're welcome to do that. If you have audio trouble, as I've mentioned before, please, whether you're on your iPad, go up to the top, or your laptop to the bottom, click the CC icon, and you'll be able to read the text of tonight's conversation. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the red Q&A box, in the question and answer box. It's in red on the bottom of your screen, and Dr. Newman will answer as many questions as possible after she finishes her presentation. And finally, if you like our programming, I ask you to please show your appreciation by donating online to Spirit Alive. Your support, along with the generous support of the Sisters of St. Joseph, makes all of this programming possible. Alternately, you can send your check to Spirit Alive. Our address is on the website. Now, I have the honor of introducing tonight's presenter, Dr. Barbara Newman, a medievalist, a literary critic, and a religious historian. She is currently a professor of English and religion and the John Evans Professor of Latin at Northwestern University. She is known for her work on medieval religious culture, comparative literature, and women's spirituality. Professor Newman is the author of 12 books, including God and the Goddesses, Vision, Poetry, and Belief in the Middle Ages, Medieval Crossover, Reading the Secular Against the Sacred, and I believe her most recent book is The Permeable Self, 5 Medieval Relationships. One important area of her research has focused on figures such as Julian of Norwich, Heloise Abelard, and Mechtilde of Hackborn. And she is acclaimed for her work on Hildegard of Bingen. In fact, Professor Newman is recognized as probably one of the finest Hildegard scholars today. Newman is a fellow and past president of the Medieval Academy of America. She received the Mellon Foundation Distinguished Achievement Award in 2009 and has held fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation at Bellagio, Italy. We're all jealous of that, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are so privileged this evening to have Professor Newman with us and look forward to her presentation entitled Sexuality and the Sacred in Christian Tradition. So thank you, Dr. Newman, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Good evening to everyone. Today's lecture deals with a truly enormous theme. So please forgive me for treating some aspects of it superficially. The problem of sexuality has, of course, been central to Christian spirituality through all ages, but I'm a medievalist by trade, so that's why many of the examples and images that I'm going to show you this evening come from that period. So we begin with a paradox. The Catholic Church has almost always treated literal sex as bad, the consequence, if not actually the cause, of original sin, while using symbolic sex as good, as its favorite image for the heights of divine love. And just in case you wonder, what you see on the right is an image of Christ standing behind one of his brides. Now, sacred sexuality is very deeply rooted in the Bible, in both testaments, while the aversion to sexuality is not found so much in the Bible as in the philosophical traditions of ancient Greece, especially Platonism and Stoicism. But I'm going to assume that you heard about that in last week's lecture, so I will touch on it only lightly tonight. Let's take a brief look, though, at the origins of the celibate tradition. Jesus, of course, was a big fan of marriage. It was the first sacrament created by God in the Garden of Eden. What therefore God has put together, let no one put asunder. Divorce is tantamount to adultery. It's a violation of the Ten Commandments. And that position, as you know, has shaped Catholic doctrine to this day. The disciples of Jesus were alarmed by his teaching, which was stricter than that of most rabbis, and they replied, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is not expedient to marry." Doubtless some people wondered if that was why Jesus himself was never married, again, something that was most unusual for a rabbi. Jesus answered with his enigmatic saying about eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven, which would become yet another foundation of the long tradition of celibacy. There are some who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. Now, it's common to contrast the Catholic world with its monks, nuns, and celibate priests to Judaism, which has no place for consecrated celibacy. In fact, to marry and raise children is a mitzvah for Jews, and marital sex on the Sabbath is a holy obligation. All this is to fulfill God's first commandment, be fruitful and multiply. Yet, in the time of Jesus, there were some short-lived Jewish experiments with celibacy. The desert community of the Essenes were probably the people responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some scholars believe that John the Baptist emerged from or spent some time with that community. And the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who was a contemporary of St. Paul, describes and praises another monastic community for men and women in Egypt, the so-called therapeutae. It means helpers. We don't know a great deal about either of these communities, but it does seem that some Jews valued at least short-term celibacy, either for the sake of contemplative prayer, like the therapeutae, or because they thought the end of the world was at hand, like the Essenes. These Jewish traditions in Palestine and Egypt may have influenced early Syriac Christianity. What you see on the slide is, of course, not early Syriac Christianity, but prelates of the Syrian church today. Now, the Syrian church perceived celibacy as an essential part of the Christian faith. We know their theology from figures like the hymn writer Ephraim of Nisibis and the hermit Aphrahat. Calling themselves the sons and daughters of the covenant, these Syriac Christians believed that baptism not only washed away sins, but restored the pristine virginity enjoyed by Adam before the fall. They enthusiastically took up Christ's saying that the children of the kingdom neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. One of their preferred titles for Christ was Ihidaya, the single one, and they strove to imitate him by remaining single themselves. Celibacy could be justified either negatively or positively. On the negative side, and this is very well known, there is St. Augustine's familiar teaching on original sin, which he spelled out in many of his works. It would remain normative in the church well into the 20th century. For Augustine, sexuality as we know it is both sin and a punishment for sin. When Adam disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden, God retaliated by making the man's, and I do mean man's, sexual organs disobedient to his will. This results in the disordered passion of concupiscence or lust. Because every child is conceived in lust, it inherits the original sin by a quasi-biological mechanism. The taint is transmitted to the offspring through semen and can only be washed away by the waters of baptism. That is why Jesus, in order to be sinless, had to be born of a virgin with no human father. Needless to say, moral and spiritual growth requires a constant struggle against sexual temptation. And if you've read Augustine's Confessions, you know that he very famously recalls his own struggle in that autobiography. Now, for women, celibacy, and especially virginity, held a promise of transcending the disability of feminine gender. St. Jerome, who was St. Augustine's contemporary, wrote that as long as a woman is for birth and children, she is as different from man as body is from soul. But when she wishes to serve Christ more than the world, then she will cease to be a woman and will be called man. Many women in the ancient world, from wealthy Roman matrons to the desert mothers, eagerly accepted this challenge, renounced their sexuality, and reinvented themselves as virile women, which was considered a high compliment. By the 4th century, these virgins were being resexualized as brides of Christ, their eroticism no longer denied, but redirected toward the divine. So let us turn to that theme. Running Athwart the Rejection of Sexuality is a short but powerful book of the Bible, which I hope you've all read, the collection of archaic Hebrew love poems known as the Song of Songs. The Song is one of only 2 books in the Bible that never mention God. The other is the Book of Esther. On the face of it, it is entirely secular. In fact, its origins might even be pagan. One of the most important religious rituals in the ancient Near East involved the annual mating of a god and goddess, which ensured the fertility of the earth with its crops, animals, and people. The god Dumuzi, or Adonis, represented the heavens with their life-giving rain, while the goddess called Inanna, or Ishtar, or Astarte, these deities have many names, represented the fertile earth. In ancient times, their marriage was enacted every year in a sacred sexual union between the king, standing in for the god, and a priestess who personified the goddess. Some of the hymns and songs for these ancient rituals survive, and they resemble cruder versions of the Song of Songs. But I am not saying that the Song of Songs is an ancient fertility ritual. There is no explicit reference to such a pagan ritual in the song. And even if this hypothesis is true, the book's pagan prehistory would certainly not have been known to the Jews who accepted it as Holy Scripture. The Song of Songs is one of the most beautiful erotic poems in all literature, but its language is strange and erotic. Not only erotic, but exotic. It is a language of the senses, with the pleasures of sight, taste, and smell brought into play to heighten and express the pleasures of touch. Now, if you think about it, you'll realize that we have no language for sexual experience except metaphor. We have profanity, and we have the clinical language of medicine, but neither of these will do when you're really in love. In that regard, sexual experience is a bit like spiritual experience, so it's no coincidence that each has been used as an image of the other. Notice how often the lovers in the song evoke perfume or food to speak about their lovemaking or to praise each other's bodies. We will extol your love more than wine. My beloved is to me a bundle of myrrh that lies between my breasts. Sustain me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am faint with love. The song is about desire, beautiful bodies, and exuberant youthful sexuality, all expressed in terms of the natural world and its fertility. I come to my garden, my sister, my bride. I gather my myrrh with my spice. I eat my honeycomb with my honey. I drink my wine with my milk. Yet this love is not merely hedonistic, but deeply committed. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is strong as death, passion fierce as the grave. This fervent vow is doubtless one reason the protagonists of the Song of Songs are called bride and bridegroom, even though certain passages suggest an illicit affair. If you don't believe me, read it again carefully tonight and you will see what I mean. Now, during the time of Jesus, the Song of Songs was apparently performed as a secular entertainment at weddings. The Talmud tells us that in the first century, when the rabbis were discussing which books should count as scripture, there was initially strong sentiment against the song, until the great Rabbi Akiva settled the question. According to Rabbi Akiva in the Talmud, all the world is not worth the day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. All the writings are holy, but the Song of Songs is the Holy of Holies. Interestingly, though, he denounced the practice of singing the song at weddings and banquet halls. His own reading, which became standard among Jews, was an allegorical one. Allegory is a technique for interpretation that relies on symbolic rather than literal reading. The characters, events, and images are not what they appear to be, but have hidden meanings that are accessible only to those who possess the secret code, the true or deeper interpretation. In this reading, the Song of Songs is an allegory of God's love for his people. The bridegroom is God, and the bride is Israel. This interpretation is based on a metaphor found explicitly in several of the prophets, such as Hosea, where God says to Israel, I will take you as my wife forever. I will take you for my wife in righteousness and justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. In accord with this reading, the Song of Songs has been used liturgically ever since the 8th century of the Common Era on Judaism's most solemn feast day. It is the festival scroll read at the very end of the Passover Haggadah, and it is recited after the Seder meal has been completed to celebrate the love between God and Israel. Among early Christians, the Jewish allegorical reading was retained, but with a twist. Because Christians saw themselves as the new Israel, they understood the bridegroom as Jesus Christ and his bride as the church. This is the same allegory of marriage found in St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. A man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a great mystery, Paul says, and I am applying it to Christ and the church. The 3rd century theologian Origen wrote an influential commentary on this book, which paradoxically reserves it only for those who are so pure in spirit that they will never be tempted by carnal desires. In the Middle Ages, therefore, the Bible's sacred love song became the special property of monks and nuns who were vowed to a life of chastity. As I'll discuss later on, St. Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century wrote 86 sermons on the Song of Songs for the benefit of celibate monks, and his work caught on like wildfire. Here you see the personified church as the bride of Christ in a 12th century mosaic from the Roman Church of Santa Maria in Trastevere. The song is open to the Latin verse, "His left hand is under my head, his right hand embraces me." The bride and bridegroom are sharing a throne as king and queen of heaven. But there's yet another version of the allegorical bride. This is a manuscript illustration from early 14th century Prague. Here you see the risen Christ with the bloody marks of the nails still clearly visible in his hands and feet, embracing his bride. And who is that bride? None other than the Virgin Mary. This is a late medieval variation on the notion of Christ as bridegroom. Although Mary is his mother, she is also represented as the bride because no one can be more intimate with God than she is. It is understood that this love is chaste, incestuous, yes, but not overtly sexual. The last image is from a luxurious illustrated prayer book called the Rothschild Canticles, which was produced for a wealthy French nun around 1300. "Upon my bed at night," says the bride, "I sought him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not." Here the bride, actually the nun who owned the manuscript, lies in bed, gazing up longingly at Christ, her beloved, who is playing peekaboo with her from heaven. In this version, every soul who loves God can play the role of the bride and be united with him in ecstatic rapture. So, the divine allegorical romance. Why do so many modern Christians have trouble with medieval mystics? When I lecture to my own students on this topic, I often encounter disbelief, even disgust. When mystics talked about the love of God, did they really mean that kind of love with all of that explicit sexuality? An answer might begin with Jesus's first and great commandment, which is, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind and with all thy strength." But doesn't that also mean with all thy body? Since whether we like it or not, we do have bodies. Let's begin with an extreme case. Here we see a famous Roman sculpture by the Baroque artist Gian Lorenzo Bernini. It illustrates a passage from the autobiography of Saint Teresa of Avila, a Spanish mystic written a century earlier. We see the saint in her ecstasy having what looks for all the world like a sexual experience, while a smiling seraph shoots her with an arrow of love. Look well, then let's put that image on hold, and we'll come back to her in a few minutes. Christians, unlike Jews and Muslims, worship God incarnate, which means embodied. At the moments of Christ's life that stirred the greatest devotion, the Nativity and the Passion, he is shown almost completely naked in art, and he inspired the same kind of love that other naked, beautiful, vulnerable bodies inspire. So is this kind of love somehow blasphemous, as many Christians nowadays feel? Let's look at a famous passage from the Passion of St. Agnes, a much beloved teenage martyr of the early church. Here are her words. "I love Christ, into whose chamber I shall enter. whose mother is a virgin, whose father knows not woman, whose music and melody are sweet to my ears. When I love him, I remain chaste. When I touch him, I remain pure. When I possess him, I remain a virgin. I am betrothed to him whom the angels serve, at whose beauty the sun and moon marvel. Behold, what I yearned for, I already see. What I hoped for, I already embrace. I am united with him in heaven, whom on earth I loved with all my heart. There is a deep paradox here, for this text is all about love, touching, embracing, possession, sexual union, but it also claims to be about chastity, purity, and virginity. In the Middle Ages, the words ascribed to St. Agnes were read at the profession of every nun, which was quite literally a betrothal. The new nun was becoming a bride of Christ. She would go to her profession in secular clothes. In modern times, a wedding gown is often used. In the course of the ceremony, she would change to her monastic habit and receive the cross, ring, and veil of a religious, a ceremony that probably many of you who are watching have experienced yourselves. Now, although the metaphor remains strongly gendered, it was not exclusive to consecrated women. Monks could also share the bridal role. And by the early modern period, even laymen were encouraged to see their own souls as brides of Christ. Let's say more about mystical eros. Mystical eros is one way of internalizing the nun's consecration, living out the sexual feelings appropriate to marriage. But wherever there's sex, there's gender. All erotic love is gendered, and by far the best known version of mystical eros is a standard heterosexual one. The bridegroom is God or Christ, while the feminine soul, in Latin anima, is the bride. But when you think about it, much of the literature on erotic spirituality was written by monks, and in the first instance, for monks. So in order to inhabit the role of the bride, these men had to perform a kind of metaphorical queering of their souls. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote his sermons on the Song of Songs for his own monks, who transgendered their souls just as he did to play the role of the bride. And Bernard had so much to say about the mystical eros in the Song of Songs that in 86 sermons, he didn't get beyond 2 chapters. This mystical eros was universal. We now might think of it as queer, but nobody did at the time because gender was seen largely in terms of an active-passive dichotomy. The Word of God was the wooer, playing the active masculine role, while the soul did not initiate but responded to the love of God. There was a surprising amount of free play with gendered metaphors. Both the bride and the bridegroom had breasts yielding milk, and God, as well as the soul, possessed a womb. We see a more unusual instance of male homoeroticism in the visions of Rupert of Deutz, another 12th century monk. One day he is praying with great love when he sees Jesus on the crucifix come to life so that he can kiss and embrace him. Note that their desire is mutual. When I had quickly entered the altar, Rupert writes, I seized him whom my soul loves. I held him, I embraced him, and I kissed him for a long while. I sensed how joyfully he received this gesture of love, since as he was being kissed, he opened his mouth, that I might kiss him more deeply. Although this is, on one level, a homoerotic experience of God, on another, it is allegorical, for the kiss of Christ fills Rupert with the Holy Spirit, inspiring him in his monumental work of biblical exegesis. An alternative to feminizing the soul is feminizing God, which was not rare. The best known examples of the feminine divine may be those in the visions of Hildegard of Bingen, but both male and female mystics were attracted to a deity they loved under such feminine names as Wisdom, Lady Love, and many others. In fact, mystical texts can be rife with gender ambiguity and fluidity. Henry Suso, a 14th century Dominican friar, represents his beloved eternal wisdom as both Christ and a beautiful woman. In this illustration, you see the servant of God opening his robe to reveal his heart, where eternal wisdom embraces his childlike soul as a mother. In his autohagiography, The Life of the Servant, Suso tried to describe this beloved. Is she divine or human, man or woman, art or knowledge or what? She was suspended high above him on a throne of clouds. She shone as the morning star and dazzled as the glittering sun. Her crown was eternity, her attire blessedness, her words sweetness, and her embrace the surcease of all desire. She was distant yet near, far above yet low, present yet hidden. For the full fervor of mystical eros, let's return to Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa. Here is the visionary text that inspired Bernini's sculpture. Teresa wrote, "In the angel's hands I saw a long golden spear, and at the end of the iron tip I seemed to see a point of fire. With this he seemed to pierce my heart several times, so that it penetrated to my entrails. When he drew it out, I thought he was drawing them out with it, and he left me completely afire with a great love for God. The pain was so sharp that it made me utter several moans, and so excessive was the sweetness caused by this intense pain that one can never wish to lose it, nor will one's soul be content with anything less than God." Note that the saint says the arrow pierced her heart, but that is not where it's pointing in the sculpture. Yes, this is defiantly erotic love of God. To Christians who claim that the love of God ought to be purely spiritual, mystics would reply that we are not, in fact, pure spirits, so we can only love as the embodied beings that we are. Another well-known example of mystical eros is the Beguine Hadewig, who lived in Brabant, in what is now Belgium, in the mid-13th century. Little is known of Hadewig's life, but she was a brilliant poet, a visionary, and a mystical theologian. Her day job probably involved nursing the sick poor, as well as teaching her young beguines. And if you don't know what a beguine is, this was a medieval woman who lived a religious life similar to a nun, but without taking vows, so that she could leave at any time. She was not under permanent vows. Now, in this vision, which Hadewig experienced in her youth, she describes an encounter with Christ as she is receiving communion. "He came in the form and clothing of a man," she writes, "as he was on the day when he gave us his body for the first time. Looking like a human being and a man, wonderful and beautiful and with glorious face, he came to me as humbly as anyone who wholly belongs to another. Then he gave himself to me in the shape of the sacrament, in its outward form, as the custom is. After that, he came himself to me, took me entirely in his arms, and pressed me to him, and all my members felt his in full felicity, in accordance with the desire of my heart and my humanity. So I was outwardly satisfied and fully transported. Also then, for a short while, I had the strength to bear this, but soon, after a short time, I lost that manly beauty outwardly in the sight of his form. I saw him completely come to naught, and so fade and all at once dissolve that I could no longer recognize or perceive him outside of me, and I could no longer distinguish him within me. Then it was to me as if we were one without difference. What I want to emphasize is the progression of Hadavi's ecstasy. First, she sees Jesus in his humanity, then she receives communion, and then has a totally satisfying sexual encounter in accordance with the desire of my heart and my humanity. But that is not the end of the experience, for now Jesus dissolves and vanishes as the two become completely one. In the perfection of love, the lover disappears because they are no longer two separate beings, but one without difference. Some earthly lovers say they wish that could happen, but it's only possible in the divine realm. For Hadavi, the goal of mystical love is not the pleasure of the erotic experience, but the total union with God, which it both symbolizes and brings to pass. Almost 200 years after Hadavi, the Englishwoman Marjorie Kemp lived out her own version of this union in 15th century England. Although she was married and the mother of 14 children, Marjorie Kemp began to live an intense spiritual life at the age of around 40. After a long apprenticeship in mystical prayer, Christ commanded her to start wearing all white clothes. This was unheard of and baffled everyone who saw her. Nuns did not ordinarily wear white, and neither did virgins. But some thought Marjorie was laying claim to a virginity she didn't possess. When she agreed that she was not a virgin, but a married woman, whose husband, what husband was she referring to? Could she be the wife of Jesus and John Kemp at the same time? It was a bold experiment. She thought she could, but it's no wonder she got in trouble for it. Jesus's endearments show how literally the mystical marriage could be interpreted. But notice the totality of Jesus's relationship to Marjorie Kemp. She is at once his daughter, his wife, his lover, his mother. Daughter, he promises her, you may boldly, when you are in bed, take me to you as your wedded husband, as your dear darling, and as your sweet son. You can boldly take me in the arms of your soul and kiss my mouth, my head, and my feet as sweetly as you want. Marjorie was lucky to have a supportive husband, in addition to Christ, because her constant weeping, screaming, and flamboyant behavior attracted a lot of unwelcome attention. More than once, she was threatened with being burned at the stake as a heretic. And if you have not read her book, simply called The Book of Marjorie Kemp, often called the first autobiography in the English language, it is an absolutely fascinating piece of work. I highly recommend it. Mystical eros was not always sweet and tender. Sometimes, very much like patriarchal marriage, it had elements of sadomasochism. In fact, medieval definitions of love privileged suffering. Love was called a passion, from the Latin noun passio, which means suffering or being passive, because the lover experienced love as an overwhelming external force that he or she was powerless to resist. Like Cupid's arrows, love struck the heart through the eyes, taking the lover captive to obey its commands. Here we see two images of the bride shooting her divine bridegroom in the heart. The top right image follows the conventions of courtly love iconography. In the bottom left, we see the side wound of Christ's passion as the mark of a javelin shot by his beloved. Hence, he becomes the speaker of that verse in the Song of Songs, "You have wounded my heart, my sister, my bride." But the heavenly bridegroom himself could be even more ferocious. In a 14th century German work called Christus und der minnende Seele, or Christ and the Loving Soul, the love affair of Christ and the soul is illustrated in extremely sadistic detail. This is one of a dozen slides that show Christ tormenting his bride. Like a medieval husband, here he beats his wife to teach her good behavior, among many other tortures that she must undergo before she is found worthy of heavenly reward. So let us turn to the church and secular marriage. Compared to the elaboration of texts about mystical eros, which included a vast number of commentaries on the Song of Songs, the theology of marriage developed slowly and sluggishly. Symbolic sexuality was so much more interesting and so much more sacred than the literal kind. For centuries, the most important contribution to the theology of marriage was again that of Augustine, who justified marriage on the ground of its three goods. Marriage for him meant simply legitimized sex. Companionship didn't enter into it, for in the common view of the ancient world, a male friend would have served far better than a woman for any purpose other than sex. Augustine's three goods of marriage were fides, proles, and sacramentum, the vowed fidelity of husband and wife, the production of offspring, and not least, the symbolic meaning of marriage as spelled out by St. Paul. Each of these goods, in turn, justified a prohibition. Fides banned adultery, proles forbade contraception, and sacramentum meant there could be no divorce, any more than Christ and the church could ever be divorced. Medieval theologians also justified marriage as a remedy against sin, since it was better to marry than to burn. As St. Paul said, the availability of a illicit sexual partner kept both men and women from committing the mortal sins of adultery or fornication. But marriage did not become a sacrament until the 12th century. Until then, it remained a largely secular affair arranged by the parents of the bride and the groom. In that innovative era, theologians like Peter Lombard and Hugh of St. Victor introduced a radical new proposition. It was not parental agreement, the payment of a dowry, or even sex that made a marriage, but consent. In principle, this meant the consent of both partners. An unwilling bride could not be forced into a union. But consent should not be confused with choice, for an obedient daughter was expected as a matter of course to comply with her parents' wishes. Every now and then, someone rebelled, either to elope with a lover of her choice or to become a religious. In 12th century England, the celebrated Christina of Markyat fought tooth and nail to preserve her vow of virginity, resisting the husband chosen by her wealthy parents. They were willing to try anything, getting her drunk, smuggling the bridegroom into her chamber while she hid behind a tapestry, even seeking to have her gang raped by his friends. Anything. But Christina eventually escaped on horseback by night, dressed in men's clothing, and hid in a tiny hermitage for years until the marriage could be annulled. At last, she fulfilled her desire to become a bride of Christ, only to fall in love with one cleric after another. In her case, sexuality was not so easily tamed. With this new theological principle that marriage was based on the consent of the couple, not their parents, thorny issues about the place of sex arose. What if a couple agreed to marry, but one of them later backed out? What if a betrothal took place, but a previous partner showed up at the wedding and claimed to have prior rights? What if the marriage vows took place in secret to foil parental wishes, a so-called clandestine marriage? The annals of canon law are full of cases in which a court was asked to decide whether such a marriage was valid. Often the deciding factor was whether or not it had been consummated. After sexual union, the couple were truly married, despite any irregularities in their vows. Another complicating factor might be a husband who turned out after the wedding to be impotent. If he truly were, the marriage could be annulled. But first, he might be advised to try it with prostitutes to see if he was truly impotent or simply averse to his bride. Yet another question concerned couples who decided by mutual agreement to keep their marriage chaste. It was agreed that Mary and Joseph had an ideal marriage. But since Mary was a perpetual virgin, sex could not be seen as essential to the sacrament. Such unions were called spiritual marriages and often idealized. Some couples would have as many children as they wanted or could afford, then take a vow of spiritual marriage to hold the line. Or a woman with saintly ambitions, such as Marjorie Kemp, could badger her husband until he finally consented to a vow. Although I cannot carry this tale beyond the Middle Ages, what is remarkable about the theology of marriage is how little has changed since then. As you surely know, contraception and divorce are still forbidden. Virginity is still officially preferred to marriage, and same-sex unions are, of course, off limits. The good of raising children still takes precedence over the personal happiness of the couple. In practice, of course, secular assumptions about love and sexuality have done a great deal to modify the official theology. But that is a story for others to tell. For now, I'm sure you have a lot of questions, and so I am happy to take them and answer as many as I can. And so thank you very much for listening.
Here we go. Hi, Barbara. I'm sure a lot of people chuckled along the way as you were speaking. So let me just remind folks, if you have some questions, you feel free to put them in the Q&A box. I'd like to start. I was just thinking, listening to you, some of what you read from the Middle Ages, if people wrote those kinds of things today, uh, I wonder what would happen to them. But what I want to know is that whole tradition of erotic spirituality to which we referred, where did it go after the Middle Ages? I mean, what happened to that kind of literature?
Yeah, it remains. You still find it in non-spirituality. You find it in the Counter-Reformation. You find it. I mean, even Thérèse of Lisieux saw herself very much as a bride of Christ, but it becomes less public and much more cloistered. And it becomes something that, rather than sort of occupying a prominent place in the religious culture as a whole, is kind of confined, and it remains the property really of cloistered nuns. But I mean, it's still there, I think, in the spirituality of a lot of religious orders. Even into the early 20th century, I mean, you find these images of young women going in bridal gowns to take their vows as nuns and then changing into their habit.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think we have a question here. Let me get you. Is there any questioning of the gender binary in the medieval theology?
There is no such thing as non-binary gender as we think of it today, but there certainly is fluidity. There's a lot of play with gender. You do see men taking feminine roles and women taking masculine roles. You see God gendered in all kinds of different ways. And I think in a way, the fact that social gender roles were so rigid meant that there could actually be more freedom with metaphorical gender roles because it was less threatening in a way. It was seen as a kind of play. And so you do see quite a lot of that. You see quite a lot of play with gendered imagery. The womb of Christ, that kind of thing.
Anybody else? Barbara, maybe you don't know this, but I was thinking as you were talking about the ecstasy of Saint Teresa of Avila, whose writing describes an orgasm. It sounds like, I mean, was this, so what, is there any of us, I mean, these people had a literal sexual life. I mean, where did they get all this imagery from? Because uh, that's a remarkable description of what you didn't have or do, which always raises questions about what people do when they're able to describe what she described. So, can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yeah, well, of course, Saint Teresa read a lot of romances as a young woman. When she first became a nun, she wasn't particularly fervent. That her conversion really came later after she had joined the order, and she read romances. I mean, she read that kind of literature, but I think, sexuality is just part of the equipment of the human person. I mean, you don't have to read about it to experience it. Um, and but she would also have been familiar with this culture of nuns being brides of Christ and so forth. So, it wouldn't have been something strange to her, but there's a whole ongoing tradition where nuns read the writings of earlier nuns, and sermon literature even used this erotic imagery, not as intense as Teresa's, to be sure, but it's out there. It's one of the available languages. And as long as it's directed toward the divine, it's not really under suspicion. It's an acceptable language to use for expressing the love of God.
Great, thank you. Well, we have a ton of questions now. So what is going to happen to the idea of marriage as sacrament only for procreation of children in the 21st century?
Well, what is officially going to happen to it, you'd have to ask the Pope, I suppose. But that has been kind of fading since the mid 20th century because, there is so much more emphasis now on the personal and mutual fulfillment of the couple, on their emotional needs, on the need for a wholesome sexual life to maintain their relationship. There has been some chipping away at this Augustinian theology of sex as always, always sinful. Concupiscence is the punishment for sin. I don't think it has ever been officially repudiated. I don't know if it ever will be officially repudiated, but you can certainly sort of sideline it and de-emphasize it. And that's what I see happening now. I see very little emphasis on that old, anti-sexual theology of marriage. It's certainly still out there, but, I haven't heard it preached at any weddings lately, fortunately.
The next questioner, Justin, says, why do you think there has been so little change in the official views on sexuality in the church since the 12th century?
Yeah, I think, well, change is not something that the church particularly loves. I mean, we all know that. But it is surprising how central that theology is when you think about it, because the notion of original sin transmitted to every single human being except Jesus and Mary by a special exception, um, that is so central to the theology of the fall, to the theology of baptism, to the theology of the redemption, to the theology of the virgin birth. I mean, that is, it's not just, even though a lot of Catholics now would just like to sideline it, it's not something that can easily be done, because Augustine, for 1,000 years at least, was the most influential of all Catholic theologians. And this theology is just at the core of so much that it is really hard to repudiate it without kind of making a house of cards fall in its wake. And so, you can change emphases, but there has really been no direct renunciation of that theology, and I'm not looking to see it anytime soon.
Mhm. Barbara, one of my sisters, Peggy Fanning, comments, the inability to speak accurately about spiritual, mystical love perhaps is the reason for our inability to speak accurately about true mystical union.
Okay,
It's just a comment,
that's a
not a
comment. Okay,
question.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for that.
One asked, what is the place of masturbation in the spiritual life?
Oh, yes. Well, I don't think any spiritual authority has ever recommended it. Um, Thomas Aquinas thought it was a mortal sin. He thought that masturbation was a sin worse than rape, because masturbation is against nature, and rape is at least according to nature. You had a whole sexual ethics developed in the Middle Ages that's based entirely on acts rather than on relationships. What matters is who does what to whom, at what time, in what position. Do you use the woman in the correct position? Are you having sexual relationships at a permitted time or at a forbidden time, like on the vigil of a feast day? Are you doing it with the right motive, namely to procreate children and not just for the pleasure of it or even for the sake of love? And I think that this whole approach to sexuality based on acts rather than relationships seems to us now very, very strange, because we see sexuality, of course, in the context of a relationship, right? And if you look at masturbation, well, that's not a relationship, it's a relationship with yourself. And so it might be seen, as harmless, that it wouldn't be seen as some kind of ideal form of sexuality, but the horror that it evoked for so long, for so many centuries, was based on this whole notion of its being counter to nature. I mean, the worst sexual sins were the sins that were opposed to nature.
Thank you. One person wrote, there surely were LGBTQ people prior to our era. What historical resources are there that acknowledge this reality, or was it always in the closet?
Yeah. The easiest to trace would be gay men. You do find accounts. You have romances about. They're called romances of friendship. I call them bromances, about two men, two male friends who love each other dearly, who obviously place their loyalty to each other above marriage, above children, above everything else. You have historical accounts of men who loved each other. Often it's a slur. It's considered, as a negative thing, but not always. There's a whole 12th century Latin literature by priests and clerics about same-sex relationships. Whether they're consensual relationships or whether they're now what we would call abuse or pederasty is an open question. It's very contested literature. There are occasional records of lesbians. They're harder to trace. They're less public. Transgender is kind of interesting because you have quite a number of cases of what I refer to as Vera women, as women who take on the masculine role, and that is seen as a kind of spiritual betterment. I mentioned the case of Christina of Marquette, who wanted to be a nun. Her parents wanted her to marry. Eventually, she put on men's clothing and fled in male garb. We know of a woman named Hildegard of Schönau in the 12th century who put on male guise permanently and became a monk. She didn't want to be a nun. She wanted to be a monk. And there's a whole series of mostly legendary, but perhaps a few real saints from the 4th, 5th century, the early centuries, where they used to be called transvestite saints. Now we would call them transgender saints, who were women who were for various reasons, transformed themselves into men and lived their life living in a male persona, usually in a monastery. Some of them are saints, that they weren't officially canonized, but they were venerated as saints because their identity wasn't discovered until after they died, and the monks washed the body of their brother and they found, it's a sister. But yeah, there are some historical resources, and work is being done by historians of gender on some of these cases.
So here's a question. How did the medieval mystics avoid the fundamentalism that is so common today? It seems that many people today want to interpret a mystical relationship with God in a rather fundamentalist manner, which makes the playfulness exhibited in medieval mysticism rather bizarre.
Well, I don't think mysticism and fundamentalism really mesh very well because, fundamentalism, you have a kind of literalism. Fundamentalism is not playful at all, right? And mysticism is. And one of the things that any mystic will say, anyone who writes about mysticism will say, is there is no literal language to talk about it. It's ineffable. There's no language at all. All you can use is metaphor. And the metaphor often reaches from a distance. And if you insist on taking language literally, you can't be a mystic. It just doesn't work because that kind of encounter with God, that kind of experience is beyond understanding. It is beyond language. So I would say, the two are just not compatible.
Mhm. Is there any evidence of backlash from the medieval church establishment to such erotic writing? The writer says, I can't imagine today's hierarchy letting this type of writing be made public.
Yeah, well, some mystics were persecuted, not necessarily for erotic language. Marjorie Kemp, the one who wore the white clothes, certainly got into trouble all the time, but it wasn't for erotic language. She got into trouble because wherever she went, she would have screaming fits. She would cry and shout and go, ah! And her love of God was so intense that it caused her to scream, and she would just drive people nuts. And she would, start rolling on the ground like a woman in childbirth. And people would say, this isn't mysticism. I mean, they didn't use the term mysticism. They would say, this isn't the love of God. She's having a fit. She has some kind of illness. But some of the women, Hadavik, for example, I read her account of this mystical experience of Christ at communion. She certainly got into trouble, but again, not for her eroticism. She got into trouble because she was perceived as too difficult a teacher. Her own beguines thought her teaching was too difficult to follow and to obey, and so they kicked her out of their community. So yes, mystics often did get into trouble, but the eroticism wasn't necessarily as confounding as many people would find it today.
Let me see. Here's a question. Do you think or believe today the church is still in denial of the physical experience of sexual desire?
Well, I don't know what exactly you mean by denial. I mean, clearly people experience sexual desire physically. Um, when you say, is the church still in denial? Does the church still lament these feelings as sinful? Some people certainly do, and I think that this is a complicated subject that I can't really get into here, but I think that sexual repression and sexual abuse have a great deal in common, because the more terrified we are of sexuality, the more we find it difficult to admit having sexual feelings, the more they seek outlets in forbidden forms. And I think the whole problem of sexual abuse and pederasty and celibacy has a lot to do with this long history of sexual repression. But that's just the beginning of what could be, another hour's lecture at least.
Mhm. So here's a question, if you'd like to take it. Will you comment on the Sensus Fidelium as studying what people actually experience of sexuality as a legitimate source of spiritual wisdom? Um, I'm not exactly sure how I can rephrase that question, but I guess the idea is, you know, people's own experience of sexuality, is that a legitimate source of spiritual wisdom?
Yes, I think it is. And I don't want to say that all sexual feelings are automatically good or sacred any more than I would want to say that all of them are sinful and bad. But I do think sexuality is a God-given capacity. And in order to be whole, to be, loving human beings, we need to come to terms with our sexuality. That can be done in celibacy. more often it's done in relationship. But yes, certainly, I mean, how many people have come closer to God because they've fallen in love? I mean, this is a normal human experience. And you don't have to be a mystic, but I think the experience of being deeply in love, part of which is sexual desire, of course that brings a person closer to God. I mean, of course it does. I just can't think otherwise. And again, ethical questions aside, because there are always ethical questions.
Anyone else? We have time for one more question. I just have a curiosity. I don't know if you can answer it, but you, at the very beginning, you talked about the divergence between Judaism and Christianity on the whole notion of celibacy and marriage. After the Essenes died out, a Jewish sect, is there ever a time in Judaism again when there was an emergence of a group that embraced celibacy?
Judaism is not a religion that embraces celibacy. I mean, the first commandment that God gives is be fruitful and multiply. And Jews have always taken that very, very seriously. And, when I said, having marital sex on the Sabbath night is a holy obligation, I mean, it really is. And leaving children in Israel is an obligation. So no, I mean, celibacy is just not a thing in Judaism. It's a very central difference.
There's a question coming in, and I think it's from our participant in India. So if people don't mind, I see 18. This happened last week, but the question has not come on the screen just yet. And I would love for her to be able to ask her question. But I don't see it. We had this, India is far away. The internet is supposed to make this much quicker than is occurring. But I don't, she was trying to use chat, but it is disabled. Let me just see here. Matthew, can you try to open chat and see if that question came in?
I just opened up chat, so she
Okay,
should be able
let's
to write
see
it
if
now.
she's able to do that. Sister Namita, if you're there, if you put your question in chat or Q&A, we'll be able to get your question. Here it is. Was erotic imagery, Matthew, is it in chat or is it in question?
I see it.
Yes, it's in chat.
Okay, can you see it? I can't see it yet. Go ahead. Can you repeat the question and answer it?
Was erotic imagery expected among mystics in the Middle Ages? Yeah, I mean, it wasn't obligatory. There were other languages for talking about mystical experiences. You didn't have to use erotic language, especially among the saints, she writes. But it was very common, and it was normal. So yes, that's why I gave so many examples of it. And of course, I could have given many more. And both men and women used it. It wasn't just one gender that used this kind of language, but it was a normal thing. So, okay.
Well, it's now 8:45. We like to end on time. This was fabulous. I didn't mention it, but throughout the Q&A, there were many complimentary comments written. People said things like, this was great, this was fabulous. So I can't thank you enough for being with us tonight. And you left us with many incredible images. The one I like best is about Jesus is peekaboo from heaven to one of his one of his female consorts. So we're so grateful to you, Barbara, and we can't thank you enough. Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us in Spirit Alive's presentation tonight. And please join us again next month when we take up the question of gender ideology, and we have Dr. Christy Trainer and Father Charles Bouchard. So good night, everyone, wherever you are. God bless. Be safe. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Good night now.